The Ukraine war, which I will argue was provoked by the West, and especially the United States, is the principal cause of European insecurity today. Nevertheless, there's a second factor at play: the shift in the global balance of power in 2017 from unipolarity to multipolarity, which was sure to threaten the security architecture in Europe. Still, there's a good reason to think this shift in the distribution of power was manageable. But the Ukraine war, coupled with the coming of multipolarity, guaranteed big trouble, which is not likely to go away in the foreseeable future. Let me start by explaining how the end of unipolarity threatens the foundations of European stability. And then I will discuss the effects of the Ukraine war on Europe and how they interacted with the shift to multipolarity so as to alter the European landscape in profound ways. The key to preserving stability in Europe during the Cold War and all of Europe during the unipolar moment was the U.S. military presence in Europe, which was, of course, embedded in NATO. The U.S. has dominated that alliance from the beginning, which has made it almost impossible for the member states underneath the American security umbrella to fight with each other. In effect, the United States has been a powerful pacifying force in Europe. Today's European elites recognize that simple fact, which explains why they are deeply committed to keeping American troops in Europe and maintaining a U.S.-dominated NATO. It is worth noting that when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union was moving to pull its troops out of Eastern Europe and put an end to the Warsaw Pact, that Moscow did not, N-O-T, did not object to a U.S.-dominated NATO remaining intact. Like the West Europeans at the time, Soviet leaders understood and appreciated pacifier logic. However, they were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion. Simply put, achieving that outcome, i.e., preventing the United States from leaving Europe in a serious way, requires wise strategies and skillful diplomacy on both sides of the Atlantic. But that is not what we have gotten so far. Instead, Europe and the United States foolishly sought to bring Ukraine into NATO, which provoked a losing war with Russia that markedly increases the odds that the U.S. will depart Europe and NATO will be eviscerated. Let me explain. To fully understand the consequences of the Ukraine war, it's essential to consider its causes, because the reason that Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022 says a great deal about Russia's war aims and the long-term effects of the war. The conventional wisdom in the West, as all of you know, is that Vladimir Putin is responsible for causing the Ukraine war. His aim, so the argument goes, is to conquer all of Ukraine and make it part of a greater Russia. Once that goal is achieved, Russia will move to create an empire in Eastern Europe, much like the Soviet Union did after World War II. In this story, Putin is a mortal threat to the West and must be dealt with forcefully. In short, Putin is an imperialist with a master plan that fits neatly into a rich Russian tradition. There's no evidence from before February 2022 that Putin wanted to conquer all of Ukraine and incorporate it into Russia. Again, I want to emphasize, there is no evidence to support the conventional wisdom. Proponents of this wisdom cannot point to anything that Putin wrote or said that indicates he thought conquering Ukraine was a desirable goal, that was a feasible goal, and that he intended to pursue that goal. I want to repeat this. Putin never said that conquering Ukraine was a desirable goal. There's no evidence to support that. There's no evidence that he said he thought it was a feasible goal. And there's no evidence that he said, this is all before February 24th, 2022, that he intended to pursue that goal. I just would quickly point out to you, I have a number of friends who deny that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat. My response to them is it doesn't matter what you think. All that matters is what the Russians think. And it's manifestly clear that the Russians see NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Russia is clearly winning this war, and it's likely to prevail. And I believe the reason is very simple. In a war of attrition, each side tries to bleed the other side white, which means that the side that has more soldiers and more firepower is likely to emerge victorious. Russia has a significant advantage on both dimensions. For example, General Syrski says that Russia now has 3 times more forces engaged in the fight than Ukraine does. And he says that at some points along the front lines, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1. So it's an overall ratio of 3-1, says Syrski, and at some points it's 6-1. And in fact, according to numerous reports from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians do not have enough soldiers to defend the front lines. They can't thickly populate the front lines with their combat forces. They have to leave open spaces that the Russians can exploit or penetrate. In terms of firepower, throughout most of the war, Russia's advantage in artillery, which is a critically important weapon in attrition warfare, Russia has had an advantage reported to be either 3-1, 7-1, or 10-1. Russia also has a huge inventory of highly accurate glide bombs, which they have used with deadly effectiveness against Ukrainian defenses. Kyiv has hardly any glide bombs. Well, there's no question that Ukraine has a highly effective drone fleet, which was initially more effective than Russia's drone fleet. Russia has turned the tables over the past year, and Russia now has an upper hand with drones as well as artillery, as well as glide bombs. On top of that dire situation on the battlefield, Russia has a huge inventory of missiles, both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and drones that it uses to strike deep into Ukraine and destroy critical infrastructure and weapons depots. For sure, Kyiv has the capability to hit targets deep inside Russia with its drones, but it has nowhere near the striking power Moscow possesses. Moreover, striking targets deep inside Russia is going to have little effect on what happens on the battlefield where this war is being settled. This war will be settled on the battlefield where the Russians are likely to win an ugly victory. I'm choosing my words carefully here. They're going to win an ugly victory that results in a frozen conflict with Russia on one side and Ukraine, Europe, and the United States on the other side. Let me explain. Settling the war diplomatically is not possible because the opposing sides have irreconcilable differences. Moscow insists Ukraine must be a neutral country, which means it not only cannot be in NATO, it can't have meaningful security guarantees from the West. Russians insist on that. The Russians also demand that Ukraine and the West recognize their annexation of Crimea plus the 4 oblasts that they've annexed in eastern Ukraine. And their third demand is that Kyiv limit the size of its military to the point where it presents no meaningful military threat to Russia. Unsurprisingly, Europe, and especially Ukraine, categorically reject these demands. Although I believe the Russians will win and are close to winning now, the Russians will not win a decisive victory where they end up conquering all of Ukraine. I want to be very clear on that. Instead, it's likely to be, as I said, an ugly victory where Russia ends up occupying somewhere between 20 to 40% of pre-2014 Ukraine, while Ukraine ends up as a dysfunctional rump state covering the territory that Russia does not conquer.